This is the Hibiscus Princess Knit Shawl pattern. Worked from the top down, this 2-skein shawl is very simple to knit, and the pattern is very easy to memorize as you go along. The pleated ruffle is easy and makes such a romantic and flirtatious edging. This stunner couldn't be simpler. You'll want to get 2 balls of Be So Sporty yarn. You can either get 2 of the same color or 2 contrasting colors. We'll be knitting the shawl with 1 ball of yarn, and as soon as we run out of that first ball of yarn and we add the second color, that's when we begin the ruffle. You'll also need a size US 8 or 5 millimeter circular knitting needle, and you'll also need a yarn needle and scissors. Start with casting on 39 stitches. So I'm going to make a slip knot into my yarn and slide that onto the knitting needle. Now with my working yarn in the back of my hand and my tail in the front of my hand, loop the tail around my thumb, insert my knitting needle into that loop, pull the working yarn from my back index finger and pull that loop through. This is called long tail cast on. You can watch a specific video all about making this cast on technique, and I'll link that in the video description. We'll do this for a total of 39 stitches. Okay, we have all 39 stitches cast on now, and row 1 begins with a knit 1. Make sure that you grab your working yarn and not your tail yarn. Knit 1, yarn over, knit 11, yarn over, and knit 1. And we want to repeat this all the way across, or 2 more times. Okay, this is what the end of row 1 looks like. You should have 45 stitches because we increased 6 stitches across the first row. In row 2, in all even numbered rows for the rest of the first section of the shawl is just to knit across. So we're going to knit each stitch and each yarn over all the way across. So there's a knit stitch, and then when you come to a yarn over, you're going to knit that the same way that you knit the knit stitches. And this is what your work should look like at the end of row 2. On those even numbered rows, when we knit each stitch and knit each yarn over across, keep in mind we will not be changing the stitch count on those rows either. Row 3 begins with a knit 1, yarn over, knit 13, yarn over, and knit 1. Notice how there is an asterisk at the beginning of that row. That's because what we did from the beginning to this point is what we will repeat 2 more times across the row. So it's knit 1, yarn over, knit 13, yarn over, knit 1, and repeat that across the entire row. This is what your work should look like at the end of row 3. You should have increased 6 more stitches for a total of 51 stitches across this row. And now row 4 is going to be the same as row 2 and all even numbered rows for this section, and that's to knit each stitch across. This is what your work should look like at the end of row 4. Row 5 begins with a knit 1, yarn over, knit 15, yarn over, knit 1. So that knit 1, yarn over, knit 15, yarn over, knit 1 is what we will repeat across the entire row. In other words, 2 more times. This is what your work should look like at the end of row 5. You should have 57 stitches now, which is 6 more stitches than the previous odd numbered row. So now we have our established pattern. We're going to be working knit 1, yarn over, 2 more stitches in each of these sections as the previous odd numbered row, yarn over, knit 1, and you'll repeat whatever you do in this section 2 more times across the row. Then on every even numbered row, we'll knit across. So basically you want to work in this increase pattern until you run out of yarn of your first ball of Be So Sporty yarn. And then I'll show you how to add the second color of yarn and start the ruffle when you start the second ball. In order to create the volume for the ruffle, we need to do a concentrated number of increases on the first row where we change color. So pretend that I've done all of my rows and I've finished my whole entire ball of the first color of Be So Sporty Yarn. And then I would be adding my second color and starting the ruffle and doing the concentrated increases. So we're going to start the next row with color B, and we're going to knit the first stitch. Then we're going to work into we're going to knit the front, back, and front. In other words, creating 3 stitches from one in the next stitch. So it's knit into the front, the back, and the front again in that same stitch before taking it off of the knitting needle. And notice I use the tail along with the yarn, and that's how I get my ends woven in established as I go. So then we'll knit the next stitch. So now from 3 stitches we've created 5, and then the next section we're going to move our yarn to the front to begin purling. We're going to purl the first stitch, then we're going to purl into the front, back, and front of the next stitch. So it's purl into the front, purl into the back, and then purl into the front of that same stitch before sliding that stitch off of the left-hand needle. Then purl the next stitch. So again, we've taken 3 stitches and converted them into 5. So now we have a 5 set of knitting stitches and 5 set of purl stitches. We're going to move our yarn to the back of the work again, knit the next stitch, then knit into the front, back, and front of the next stitch. Knit into the front, the back, and the front, and knit the next stitch. Then move our yarn to the front of the work, purl the next stitch, then purl into the front, the back, and the front of the next stitch, and then purl the next stitch. And so we want to repeat this all the way across. This is what your work should look like at the end of the first ruffle row, which is where we did our concentrated increases. And now we've increased our pattern to becoming a multiple of 5 so that we can do a knit 5, purl 5 ribbing for the ruffle. So our next row is going to be knit the knit stitches as you see them, purl the purl stitches as you see them, and it's going to be a knit 5, purl 5 ribbing. Now, depending on when you ran out of yarn and when you started that next ruffle, it may or may not be exactly as it is written in the pattern. If you refer to the pattern, I do have line by line instructions where you can count your stitches at the end of each row so that you can count which multiple of 6 increases as you're going. So if you wanted to follow along line by line, you can, but based on your gauge and your tension, you may or may not be the same exact number of rows. So you may or may not end up on a different set of stitches. So it could end up being knit 5, purl 5 across. It could end up being purl 5, knit 5 across here. But because it's a lot of stitches, if you have to adjust for the number of stitches, it's perfectly okay. We're simply going to knit that first ball of yarn, that first color, until you run out of yarn, and then pick up with the second ball of yarn and start with the concentrated ruffle. You want to work in your established knit 5, purl 5 ribbing for 3 rows, and then we want to do one more set of increases to transform this into a knit 6, purl 6 ribbing, and then we'll do that for 1 inch. So to convert it from the knit 5, purl 5 ribbing to the knit 6, purl 6 ribbing, we're going to knit the first 2 stitches, knit into the front and the back of the next stitch, and then knit 2. So we've taken those 5 knit stitches and turned them into 6. So now for the purl section, the next 5 stitches are purl. We're going to purl the first 2 stitches, then purl into the front and the back of the next stitch, then purl the next 2 stitches. And so we'll be converting our entire ribbed ruffle now from a knit 5, purl 5 ribbing to a knit 6, purl 6 ribbing. Just give us that little bit of extra volume and flounce to our ruffle. Okay, the last section is to work in our knit 6, purl 6 ribbing for 1 inch. And what that means is when you see the knit stitches, you knit them. When you see the purl stitches, you purl them. So whether it's starting with knit, then you would knit 6 and purl 6 across. And when it starts with purl, you would purl 6 and knit 6 across. This is such an easy pattern for substituting yarn. So if you wanted to use a thicker yarn or a thinner yarn, it's top down. So if your stitches end up being a different number on any of these given rows, what I'm showing you in the video is how to conceptually work the pattern anyway. So then when you've done all of your ruffle, all of your ribbing rows, then you're going to bind off loosely as follows, in pattern. So when you're binding off in a ribbing, a lot of times a pattern will say to bind off in pattern. So when the knit stitches are presenting themselves to you, you're going to bind off in knit. So we'll knit 2 stitches to pass the first stitch up and over the second. The next stitch is a knit stitch again, so we'll knit it and then pass that first stitch up and over the second. The next stitch is also a knit stitch, so we'll knit it and then bind off. The next stitch is a knit stitch, so we'll knit and bind off. The next stitch is a knit stitch, so we'll knit and bind off. And then we come to our section of purl stitches. And so when it says bind off in pattern, it means as you're binding off, bind off in the stitch as it's presenting itself to you. So that's a purl stitch. So we're going to move our yarn to the front of the work, then knit that stitch, purl that stitch before binding off. Then we'll purl the next stitch to bind off. So it's going to be binding off in pattern for 6 purl stitch bind offs, and then we'll knit and bind off 6 stitches. And you'll repeat that across the entire row. It just gives you a little bit more texture within that ribbing on the bind off. Make sure you follow the link in the video description to download this wonderful, easy to follow pattern, and you can get information on all the beautiful yarns that I have available for making your very own Princess Hibiscus knit shawl pattern. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions at all, please feel welcome to leave them for me in the comments. And if you check out the video description, I've provided links for everything we talked about in this video. Let us make time to create, share, and inspire today and every day. I'll see you in the next video.